Well, the theological sensibility that is known as radical orthodoxy really began simply as a book series, the name of a book series in the mid-1990s. And what had happened is a group of theologians had come together in Cambridge purely by accident, not by design, and found that they were taking a very similar approach to theology and understanding the place of theology in the academy and the nature of the discipline. And so got together and decided to publish a collection of essays under the banner Radical Orthodoxy. Obviously this is quite an enticing title. It seems to be a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? Because we regard orthodoxy as terribly traditional and perhaps a little bit staid, and the opposite of what is radical and exciting. So the title was trying to say that Christian orthodoxy actually in a late modern context will appear inevitably very, very radical because of its claims. And really radical orthodoxy has been about expounding why that's the case, why a proper Christian orthodoxy will appear to us to be extremely radical and very exciting and a genuine alternative to late modern forms of philosophy or politics. So this first essay collection was published. It was edited by John Milbank, now at the University of Nottingham, Graham Ward, soon to be at the University of Oxford, and Catherine Pickstock, who's still in Cambridge. And there were a whole range of contributors, some of them still graduate students, some of them established academics, looking at a whole range of topics, from politics to the body, to the history of philosophy, to the nature of language. And this really set out a trend or a programme that was worked out in a whole series of single-authored books over the next 10 years or more. And there are, I think, 12, 13, 14 books in the Radical Orthodoxy series, and that series has spawned others with other publishers now. So people are working through this agenda. But if we want to understand what Radical Orthodoxy is really all about, we need to go back much further in theology, the recent history of theology, to understand how it fits into this broader trajectory. And one key text is undoubtedly John Milbank's Theology and Social Theory, that was published in 1990, is now in its second edition, that arrived on the scene as something of a bombshell, very controversial, very provocative, and an enormously erudite work, very daunting. Many people find it a difficult but a scintillating read. But actually the thesis behind John Milbank's book is relatively straightforward, as is so often the case. And it runs something like this, that if we look at the history of the secular and the way that the secular came to be in our culture today, there is a very, very common narrative lying behind that. And the narrative runs something like this, that in the medieval period, there is no such thing as a secular sphere. So John begins his book, "Once there was no secular," that's the famous first line. And what we mean by that is that every aspect of human life, of culture, of politics, of society, is in some sense governed by a notion of the sacred and of the transcendent. Everything is orientated towards its divine creator, its origin. And the whole of the created order is understood in this way, and the whole of culture, human work, human society is governed in some sense by its orientation to the church. So communities are gathered around their parish church, which are in turn gathered around their cathedral, and which are gathered around the bishop as a symbol of unity. And in Europe, in the early modern period, so from the 15th, 16th century, what happens is that there is a series of conflicts, the wars of religion, that religion seems to be a cause not of unity anymore, but of deep political conflict. And there needs to be some way of managing that supposed religious conflict and some way of overcoming it. And at the same time, we have also the rise of the natural sciences, the demise of the Aristotelian worldview, and a priority on reason, particularly in continental Europe, with the thought of people like René Descartes, Immanuel Kant. And they say that actually the way that we can deal with these conflicts is to posit a rationality that stands over and above all particular aspects of human culture, all religious commitment, that is in some sense objective, that is accessible to anybody by the use of their natural rational powers. And by appeal to this objective order, we can overcome the differences and the conflicts that emerge culturally, religiously, theologically. And this form of rationality is exemplified particularly in the natural sciences, although the practice of natural science, then known as natural philosophy, varies considerably. So it's very empirical, it's very observation-based in Britain. It's much more theoretical and rational in continental Europe. But nevertheless, there is a sense in which this natural philosophy, later becomes known as natural science, is objective, and it reveals the truth of things, and it is not about a sacred order, but it is about the objective perception of a natural order of objects that is distinguished from the cultural order of human subjects. And that what happens is that this kind of rationalism, this orientation towards the natural sciences, pushes back the sacred order. And so we have this theory known as desacralization, that as we push back the sacred order, the religious order, the theological order, what we're left with is the cool, clean air of objective rationality, of reason, exemplified in the natural sciences. And that this forms a kind of neutral terrain for human intellectual inquiry. And so what we then have is the religious or the theological that is really relegated to a purely private realm. And we distinguish that private realm of faith, which is now understood as merely a preference that an individual might have. We distinguish that from a realm of public reason. So faith and reason become separated, public and private become separated. So religion belongs to a private sphere. You can believe if you want to. This goes on behind closed doors, if you like. But the public sphere of rationality and reason is the sphere of the sciences. It's the sphere of philosophy, of business as well, and of government. And this is desacralized. And it is neutral. Now, what John Milbank says in Theology and Social Theory is that actually this desacralization is a myth, because what is uncovered is not a neutral territory. It's actually a territory where other forms of theology, other ultimate concerns come to take the place of Christian theology. So the secular, as this neutral terrain, this neutral sphere, is in fact still pseudo-theological. It still has accounts of ultimate meaning, ultimate priorities, ultimate orientations. These are pseudo-theological, and they are, in a sense, they're bad theology, they're idolatrous, and that this secular realm is in fact, quite literally, it's a Christian heresy, in the sense that it is still, despite all its own self-description, it's still pseudo-theological, and it's still, in some sense, parasitic on the Christian view, the sacred view that gave rise to it. But what this modern world sets up is then a whole series of dualisms, of there being two spheres to the way that we account for things, between public and private, between faith and reason, between subject and object. So, for example, religion is now private, reason is public. And today we still live with the consequences of this. So whenever religion enters into the public realm of government or any public space, whether it be schools or hospitals, this becomes a matter of concern, this becomes a matter of contention, because religion is apparently purely a private matter. But the religious themselves say, on the contrary, we all have faith of different kinds, which is always allied to reason, and religion, religious commitment, faith, theology ought to be publicly accountable and has got its own account of its own rationality and can be scrutinised, and indeed wants to scrutinise other disciplines. But what Milbank says then is that we have this invention of the secular, and it has to be invented. It's not simply revealed by the rolling back of another worldview. It has to be a positive creation that says that there is a sphere that is indifferent concerning the transcendence. It's indifferent to theological concerns. And John says, no, it can never be indifferent. It's always got some kind of hidden theology lying behind it. And what radical orthodoxy is trying to do is challenge this account of the secular and say, no, theological concerns are still very much up for grabs. And that theology concerns itself with every sphere. It's not confined simply to the private whims of individuals, but has something to say about everything. And so radical orthodoxy has a very particular account of the nature and scope of Christian theology. And this is particularly provocative. So if we examine the way that the modern university is structured, the modern university is essentially divided into two different spheres. There are faculties that deal with the natural world, with those are the natural sciences.